So I had a debate with somebody about the Federal Reserve. They said the Federal Reserve was a branch of the government. I said it's a privately owned bank. They told me to prove it, so I decided to prove it. So I also decided to turn that proof into a video. So let's begin. First, it's important to explain that Congress and the President have very little, if any, influence on policy. The Congress handed over all monetary power to the Fed in 1913. This is why Congress and the Government Accountability Office cannot audit the Fed without passing legislation to do so. Congress cannot even look at the Fed's book. If the Fed was controlled and owned by the government, this would not be an issue. But as we know, it is an issue. The Federal Reserve is a private bank, owned by banks, and pays dividends on its shares owned only by banks. It is the Fed's monetary policy that dictates the economic modalities of today, and not government policy. The Fed can create jobs by loosening credit, expand the money supply by reducing the reserve to loan ratio in banks, and alter monetary policy by controlling interest rates. These are things that the Fed does, and does alone. Congress and the President have no control of it. I guess the Fed can ask for opinions of others, but they don't have to. But let's move on to further explain how the Fed is privately owned. So, how do we determine what is government owned and what is not? And how can we correlate this concept to the Federal Reserve? The first way is to define how the Federal Reserve was implemented by delineating who was responsible for its implementation. To do this, we must first examine who came up with the idea for the Federal Reserve Central Bank in the early 1900s, when and where this happened, and any other factors that complemented the meeting. The meeting in question happened in 1910 on Jekyll Island in Georgia with 6 powerful Wall Street insiders. The participants of the conspiratorial meeting were Senator Nelson Aldrich, father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., German banker Paul Wolberg, Henry P. Davison, partner in J.P. Morgan and chairman of Bankers Trust Company, Benjamin Strong, vice president of Bankers Trust, Frank Vanderlip, chairman of National City Bank, and Charles Norton, president of the First National Bank. These 6 people were highly influential and had massive political influence at the time. The secret meeting on Jekyll Island was described in conspiratorial terms by one of its members, Frank Vanderlip. He said, quote, "Despite my views about the value to society of greater publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. None of us who participated felt that we were conspirators. On the contrary, we felt we were engaged in patriotic work. We were trying to plant a mechanism that would correct the weakness of our banking system, as revealed under the strains, pressures, and panic of 1907. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System." Now, Frank Vanderlip was linked to the Rockefellers by marriage and came into the group in early 1910 after receiving a letter from James Stillman, founder and chairman of National City Bank. The letter referred to a secret meeting between Aldrich and Stillman in Europe on the central bank question. In the letter, we learn that the conspirators used a code, and that Senator Aldrich's code name was Swivel. To quote Frank Vanderlip again, "Mr. Stillman wrote me that I should make everything else subservient to giving my whole time and thought to a thorough consideration of the subject, i.e., the currency plan, and to draft a new bill to the Congress without a Wall Street tag. Above all, the conspirators knew they had to maintain absolute secrecy. If any Wall Street name ever became attached to a central banking Federal Reserve bill, it would be the kiss of death." Not only were code names adopted, but individuals went to great lengths to avoid public knowledge of their meetings and discussions. Without any question, if the public in 1913 had known what we know today, the Federal Reserve Act would have had no possibility at all of becoming law. So here we have one of the members admitting that it was imperative to keep the meeting secret from not only Congress, but also the public, and to not attach any Wall Street tags to the bill. This would ensure that the bill made it through Congress by obscuring the details of the bill from Congress. If the Federal Reserve is part of the government, then why hide it from Congress at all? Why is there private stock in the bank? And why can't the government know who has private stock in the bank? They can, the government, determine the employees of any federal department, except the Federal Reserve. Very interesting. So now that we have established that the implementation of the Federal Reserve was created surreptitiously through a secret private meeting of Wall Street financiers to create a monopoly on the banking system, let's discuss what the investigations into the Federal Reserve came up with. A 1976 congressional report entitled Federal Reserve Directors, a Study of Corporate and Banking Influence, summarized their investigation into the Federal Reserve System. In their report, they conclude that, quote, the Federal Reserve directors apparently represent a small elite group which dominates much of the economic life of this nation. Even FDR, the most socialist president, next to Wilson, of course, wrote in a letter to Colonel House in 1933, quote, the real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the large centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson. What is important to note is that the Federal Reserve is a private system with private stockholders. The money trust of the 19th century has been granted a legal monopoly, while almost all other industry is subject to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Why is this? Why does the Fed get its own sovereignty by bypassing the Sherman Antitrust Act? Don't get me wrong. There is collusion between members of Congress and the Fed. That's why everything the Fed does gets hushed up. Politicians get payoffs from the Fed to keep themselves running. But the government doesn't own the Fed. I could expand on this and give you connections between the Board of Governors and famous plutocrats like Rockefeller and Morgan. I could expand by saying there are 3 classes of directors, and it's very rarely that Class C, the people's class, gets picked. I could describe how in 1980, the Fed tried sneaking in a section of legislation to have complete control of the monetization of foreign debt, but at the last second was noticed by Ron Paul, who made them take it out. So I could expand on all that, but I think we should end it from a quote by the Federal Reserve in San Francisco. They say, quote, some people think we are a branch of government. We are not. We are the bank's bank. I think there you have it. Oh, actually, I have to add this as well. This was a job opportunity at the Federal Reserve of San Francisco on July 16th, 1979. In it, they say, programmers. Some people still think we are a branch of the government. We are not. We're the banker's bank. At the San Francisco Fed, our computer services group continue to be a model for the National Federal Reserve System. So I think we have heard it now from the horse's mouth. The Federal Reserve is privately owned with private stockholders. I don't think people can argue this fact anymore when the San Francisco Fed has admitted it. And it should also be noted here at the end that the Federal Reserve is one of the 2 entities that a president should never mess with, or else he or she will be destroyed. The other entity is the intelligence services. If the president ever messes with the intelligence services, they can expose the president's deepest secrets. If he messes with the Federal Reserve, they can make his economy the worst of all time. So the Federal Reserve has a lot of power, and they use their power for political means. They are not a branch of the government. They are privately owned. And I'm done.